Snow is not cold. This is the fact that separates the people who survive winter from the people who merely endure it. Snow is not cold. Snow is insulation. Snow is a blanket that the sky lays over the earth every autumn, and that protects everything beneath it from the killing cold of the air above. The air temperature in January can drop to 40 below zero, 50 below, 60 below, in the interior valleys of Alaska, where the cold pools like water in a basin and the thermometer stops being a measurement device and becomes a warning. But beneath 3 feet of snow, the ground temperature is 32 degrees. Beneath 4 feet of snow, it is 35. Beneath 5 feet, it approaches 40. The snow, billions of ice crystals with air trapped between them, creates a continuous insulation layer with an R value of approximately R1 per inch, meaning that 4 feet of snow provides R48 of insulation, more than the walls of a modern well-insulated house, more than any log wall or sod wall or plank wall that a frontier builder could construct, and it is free, delivered by the sky, requiring no labor, no materials, and no cost. Every animal in the north knows this. The grouse burrows into the snow and sleeps at 32 degrees while the air above is 40 below. The vole tunnels beneath the snowpack and lives its entire winter in a world that never drops below freezing. The bear dens beneath the snow and maintains its body temperature through months of hibernation because the snow above the den prevents the killing cold from reaching the sleeping animal. The snow is not the enemy. The snow is the shelter. The cold air above the snow is the enemy, and the snow is the barrier that stands between the living and the lethal. The Yupik people of western Alaska had understood this for thousands of years. Their winter houses, the ine, were semi-subterranean structures dug partially into the earth and covered with sod, with the deliberate intention of being buried by the winter snowfall. The Iena was not a house that happened to get snowed on. It was a house designed to be snowed on, designed so that the winter snowpack would cover the walls and roof completely, encasing the structure in a continuous shell of snow insulation that transformed the house from a shelter into a thermal cocoon. The Ina in January, buried under 4 to 5 feet of snow, maintained an interior temperature of 50 to 60 degrees, with nothing but a small seal oil lamp and the body heat of the occupants. No wood stove, no fireplace, no combustion heating at all. The snow did the work. Ayuluk Kasayulia understood this the way he understood breathing, not as knowledge that had been taught, but as knowledge that had always been present, absorbed through a childhood spent in snow houses and sod houses and the white landscape of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. He was 34 years old, a quiet man with a round, weathered face the color of dark copper, small dark eyes nearly hidden in the deep creases of a permanent squint, a broad, flat nose, thin lips, black hair cropped close under a heavy wolverine fur ruff that framed his face in a dark halo. His hands were short-fingered and enormously strong, hands that had built kayak frames, scraped hides, hauled seal carcasses across ice, and shaped snow blocks with the precision of a mason shaping stone. He wore a ground squirrel parka, dozens of small pelts sewn together with sinew thread, the fur turned inward, covered by an outer shell of caribou hide that blocked the wind, and sealskin boots with grass insoles that kept his feet dry at temperatures that would freeze leather solid in minutes. Ayuluk had come to the interior of Alaska in 1889, traveling inland from the coast with his wife Pitak and their daughter Nyack, who was 7. The move was driven by the fur trade, the interior valleys along the upper Kuskokwim River, offered beaver, marten, and fox pelts that commanded good prices at the trading posts, and the forested valleys provided something the treeless coastal delta could not: wood, firewood, building timber, the luxury of burning wood for heat rather than the carefully rationed seal oil and driftwood that fueled the coastal villages. The interior was warmer than the coast in summer and colder in winter. The coast, moderated by the Bering Sea, rarely dropped below 25 below zero. The interior, with no maritime influence and cold air pooling in the valley bottoms, regularly dropped to 40 below and occasionally to 50 and 60 below during the deep cold of January and February. The cold was different from the coastal cold, drier, stiller, more absolute. On the coast, the wind was the killer. In the interior, the still air was the killer, so cold that it burned exposed skin in seconds and froze breath into a cloud of ice crystals that hung in the air like fog. The cabin that Yupik built in the summer of 1890 was a hybrid, part Yupik, part frontier. The walls were spruce logs, 8 inches in diameter, notched at the corners and chinked with moss and clay. Standard interior Alaska construction that the Russian traders had introduced, and that the indigenous and settler populations had adopted universally. The roof was spruce poles covered with birch bark and a thick layer of sod, the traditional northern roof that provided insulation and waterproofing in a single assembly. The floor was packed earth over a layer of spruce boughs, traditional Yupik flooring that provided insulation and a clean, dry surface. But the cabin had 2 features that no other cabin in the valley possessed, and both came directly from Yupik's Yupik understanding of snow as insulation. The first feature was the wall design. Yupik built the cabin with a pronounced outward lean to the walls, not vertical but angled outward at approximately 10 degrees from vertical, so that the base of each wall was approximately 18 inches inside the top. This lean was not structural. Log walls did not require a batter for stability, but thermal. The leaning walls created a wedge-shaped space between the wall exterior and the vertical snowpack that would accumulate against the cabin during winter. As the snow piled up, driven by wind and gravity against the leaning walls, it packed tightly into the wedge, filling every gap between the snow surface and the log wall with compressed snow that provided continuous contact insulation, rather than the loose air-gapped snow that accumulated against vertical walls. The lean ensured that the snow hugged the wall surface, maximizing the thermal contact and eliminating the air pockets that reduced insulation performance in conventional snowbanking. The second feature was the roof extension. Yupik built the roof with a 3-foot overhang on all 4 sides, far wider than the standard 12 to 18 inches of a conventional cabin. The wide overhang served a specific winter purpose. It caught and held the snow that accumulated on the roof, preventing it from sliding off and exposing the roof surface to the cold air. A conventional cabin roof with a steep pitch and narrow overhang shed snow efficiently, which was desirable for structural reasons, but disastrous for thermal reasons, because the shed snow left the roof exposed to the full force of the cold air, while the walls below retained their snowbanking. Yupik's low-pitched roof with wide overhangs was designed to hold snow, to accumulate a 4 to 5 foot depth of snow on the roof surface that insulated the ceiling as effectively as the wall snow insulated the walls. If you want to know what happened when a Yupik man built his cabin to be buried alive by winter snow, while every neighbor said he was building his own tomb, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The cabin was small by frontier standards, 12 feet by 14 feet, 168 square feet. because Ayuluk understood that a smaller cabin was easier to heat, easier to bury, and easier to maintain at a comfortable temperature with minimal fuel. The ceiling height was 6.5 feet, low enough that the roof snow load was manageable and high enough that Ayuluk, who was 5 feet 6 inches tall, could stand comfortably. The single door faced south, away from the prevailing north wind, and was fitted with a heavy spruce plank door on leather hinges with a caribou hide curtain inside for additional draft protection. The single window, 12 inches square, covered with translucent scraped caribou intestine rather than glass, was also on the south wall, positioned to admit the limited winter daylight. The stove was a small sheet iron box stove, purchased from the trading post for $8, connected to a stovepipe that exited through the sod roof. The stove was adequate for a cabin of this size, but small by frontier standards. A deliberate choice, because Ayuluk did not intend to heat the cabin primarily with the stove. He intended to heat the cabin primarily with snow. The first winter, 1890 to 1891, demonstrated the principle. The snow began accumulating in October, and by mid-November, the snowpack against the cabin walls was 2 feet deep. By December, 3 feet. By January, the snow had reached the eaves on the north and east walls, 4.5 feet. And the cabin was buried to the roofline on 2 sides, with 3 to 4 feet of snow against the south and west walls where the wind exposure was less. The roof held 3 feet of snow, the low pitch and wide overhangs performing exactly as designed, catching and retaining every flake that fell. The cabin was encased. The log walls, which in a conventional cabin would be exposed to air temperatures of 40 below zero, were instead in contact with snow that maintained a temperature of approximately 28 to 32 degrees, 70 degrees warmer than the air above. The roof, which in a conventional cabin would lose heat through the sod and into the freezing sky, was instead insulated by 3 feet of snow. R36 of free insulation on top of the R12 of the sod layer, for a combined roof insulation of R48. The heat loss through the walls and roof, which in a conventional exposed cabin accounted for approximately 70% of total heat loss, was reduced by the snow encasement to approximately 15% of the exposed cabin rate. The stove barely worked. Ayuluk burned approximately 1 cord of spruce per winter, a quantity so small that his neighbors assumed he was exaggerating or that his family was suffering from chronic cold. The typical interior Alaska cabin consumed 4 to 6 cords per winter, and families spent weeks of autumn labor felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking the massive woodpile that was the difference between survival and death. Ayuluk's woodpile was a modest stack against the south wall, 1 cord, neatly split and covered with birch bark, and it lasted from October through April with fuel to spare. The interior temperature of the snow-buried cabin was remarkable. On a January morning, when the outdoor air was 42 below zero, Ayuluk's cabin, with the stove burning at low rate on a single small charge of spruce loaded the previous evening, held 54 degrees at dawn. 54 degrees. The stove had been burning at minimum output for 8 hours, producing perhaps 2,000 BTUs per hour, a fraction of the output of a full-burn stove in a conventional cabin. And the cabin was 54 degrees because the snow encasement had reduced the heat loss to a level that the smallest possible fire could overcome. In a conventional exposed cabin in the same valley on the same morning, the interior temperature would have been 28 to 32 degrees at dawn, below freezing, with ice on the water barrel and frost on the interior walls, despite a stove burning at 3 to 4 times the rate of Yupik. The conventional cabin was fighting the full force of 42 below air on every exposed surface. Yupik's cabin was fighting 30-degree snow on every surface, a temperature difference of 72 degrees at the exterior surface, reduced to 0 degrees at the snow wall interface. The snow was doing what 4 cords of extra firewood could not, keeping the cold away from the cabin walls. If this story has touched you, share it and subscribe, because the quiet engineering that kept families alive and farms running for generations deserves to be remembered. Yupik managed the interior of the snow-buried cabin with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had grown up in semi-subterranean houses where space was precious and moisture management was a survival skill. The primary challenge of the snow-buried cabin was moisture. The snow encasement, while providing extraordinary insulation, also sealed the cabin from the dry outside air that provided natural ventilation in a conventional cabin. The occupant's breath, cooking steam, and body moisture accumulated in the enclosed space, raising the humidity to levels that promoted condensation on the coldest surfaces, typically the window and the door frame, where the insulation was thinnest. Yupik's moisture management protocol was simple and effective. She maintained a small opening in the stovepipe damper at all times, even when the stove was burning at minimum, to provide continuous upward ventilation through the chimney. The rising warm air exiting through the stovepipe carried moisture with it, and the slight negative pressure created by the chimney draft pulled fresh air into the cabin through the small gaps around the door frame and window, providing a slow, continuous air exchange that removed moisture without significantly cooling the interior. The ventilation rate was approximately 1 air change per hour, far less than the 5 to 10 air changes per hour in a leaky conventional cabin, but sufficient to maintain humidity at a comfortable level and prevent the condensation that would damage the cabin's interior surfaces and the family's stored food and clothing. Nyack, the 7-year-old daughter, grew up in the snow-buried cabin with a comfort that the neighboring children did not share. While the settler children in conventional cabins spent their winters huddled near the stove, wearing heavy clothing indoors, and dreading the cold floors and cold walls that made the periphery of the cabin uninhabitable, Nyack moved freely through the entire space of the snow-buried cabin. The walls were warm, not hot, but warm to the touch, because the log surface was in contact with 30-degree snow rather than 40 below air, and the interior surface of the wall reflected this. Approximately 45 to 50 degrees at the wall surface, compared to the 20 to 25 degrees that a conventional cabin's interior wall surface reached during severe cold. Nyack could lean against the wall, sit on the floor near the wall, and sleep in a bed against the wall without the cold surface heat drain that made wall contact miserable in conventional cabins. The February cold snap of 1892, 11 days of temperatures below 40, with 3 days below 55, was the extreme test. The conventional cabins in the valley entered crisis mode, stoves burning at maximum around the clock, families huddled in the warmest zone near the stove, water barrels frozen solid, frost coating every interior surface. 2 families ran short of firewood and burned furniture. 1 family abandoned their cabin and moved in with neighbors. The cold was absolute, still, and relentless. No wind, no cloud cover, just clear sky and the bottomless cold of the interior. Alaska winter radiating heat from the valley floor into space. Yupik's cabin held. The snow encasement, now at maximum winter depth, 5 feet on the north wall and 4 on the south, 3.5 feet on the roof, provided a continuous insulation shell that kept the cabin walls at approximately 28 degrees, while the air 6 inches beyond the snow surface was 55 below. The stove burned at moderate rate, slightly higher than normal, but nothing approaching the desperate maximum burn of the neighboring cabins. The interior temperature during the worst morning of the cold snap, when the outdoor air reached 58 below zero, was 46 degrees. Cold by indoor standards, but not dangerous, not freezing, not the 20-degree crisis that the conventional cabins experienced. Yupik added a second small stove charge at midnight on the worst nights, the only time during the entire winter that he needed a night reload, and the cabin recovered to 50 degrees by morning. The fuel accounting for the first winter confirmed the snow burial's extraordinary efficiency. 1 cord of spruce. The neighbors burned 4 to 6. The difference, 3 to 5 cords, represented 3 to 5 weeks of autumn labor, felling, bucking, splitting, hauling, that Yupik did not have to perform. Labor that he could redirect to trapping, food preparation, and the other activities that sustained the family through the winter. The economic value of the fuel savings was substantial. 3 to 5 cords at $5 per cord represented $15 to $25 in labor and material savings per winter. But the labor savings was even more valuable because autumn labor in interior Alaska was the scarcest resource of all. The narrow window between freeze-up and the deep cold when every task competed with every other for the limited daylight and tolerable temperatures. The spring transition required management. As the temperatures rose above freezing in April, the snow encasement began to melt, first on the south-facing walls where the spring sun hit directly, then on the roof, and finally on the north wall where the shade preserved the snowpack longest. The melting snow released water that ran down the cabin walls and pooled at the foundation, potentially saturating the earth around and beneath the cabin and creating moisture problems that would persist into summer. Yupik addressed this with a drainage system borrowed from Yupik construction practice. A shallow trench dug around the cabin's perimeter at the base of the walls, sloping away from the cabin on all 4 sides, that channeled the meltwater away from the foundation and into the surrounding forest floor. The trench was dug in the autumn before the first snow and was maintained each spring after the melt. A simple earthwork that took 2 hours to prepare and that prevented the moisture damage that would otherwise undermine the cabin's structure over time. The sod roof required specific attention during the spring melt. The melting snow on the roof saturated the sod layer, which became heavy, approximately 60 pounds per square foot when fully saturated. And the roof structure had to be strong enough to support both the winter snow load and the spring meltwater weight without sagging or failing. Yupik had built the roof with heavier poles than a standard cabin. 6-inch spruce poles at 12-inch spacing rather than the standard 4-inch poles at 18-inch spacing, specifically to support the combined snow and melt load. The heavier roof construction added approximately $50 to the cabin's construction cost, but was essential for the snow burial strategy to work safely. The adoption of the snow burial technique by other families in the valley followed the pattern that characterized every immigrant, engineering innovation on the frontier. Initial ridicule, gradual observation, eventual adoption. The first winter, Yupik's neighbors, a mix of Athabascan families and white settlers from the lower states, watched the snow bury his cabin and assumed he was simply too inexperienced or too lazy to clear the snow from his walls and roof the way a responsible homeowner should. The idea that the snow was intentional, that the cabin was designed to be buried, was so contrary to the conventional understanding of snow as an enemy to be fought and removed that it did not occur to most observers. The second winter, the neighbors began to notice the fuel disparity. Yupik's modest woodpile, one cord neatly stacked, was conspicuous next to the 4 to 6 cord piles of his neighbors, and the fact that his family was warm and healthy while burning a fraction of the fuel raised questions that could not be answered by the assumption of laziness or ignorance. Elias Dementiev, an Athabascan trapper who lived a quarter-mile upstream, visited Yupik's cabin in January 1892 and spent an evening inside. He felt the warm walls, noticed the low stove output, observed the temperature, and asked Yupik directly, "How are you doing this?" Yupik explained the snow. He took Elias outside, into the 40 below darkness, lantern in hand, and showed him the cabin encased in its snow shell. He pushed his hand into the snow at the wall surface and said, "Feel." Elias pushed his hand into the snow next to Yupik's and felt 30 degrees, cold by human standards, but warm by comparison to the 40 below air that was freezing the exposed skin of his face. Yupik said, "The snow does the work. You do not fight the snow. You use the snow. The snow is the wall." Elias built a snow burial cabin the following summer. Not a replica of Yupik's, but an adaptation of his existing cabin that incorporated the critical elements. A low-pitched roof with extended overhangs to catch and hold snow, and walls prepared for snow banking by clearing brush and debris from the base and creating a smooth surface for the snow to pack against. Elias did not angle his walls. The lean was a refinement that required new construction, but he added the drainage trench and the heavy roof structure. His first winter with intentional snow burial produced results that confirmed Yupik's experience. Fuel consumption dropped from 5 cords to 2.5. Interior temperature improved by approximately 15 degrees at dawn, and the wall surfaces, insulated by 3 to 4 feet of packed snow, were warm enough to touch without discomfort. By 1898, 6 of the valley's 12 families had adopted some version of the snow burial approach, ranging from Yupik's full design, leaning walls, extended overhangs, heavy roof, to simple snow banking, piling snow against the walls of an existing conventional cabin without structural modification. Even the simplest version, manually banking snow against the walls to a depth of 2 to 3 feet, reduced fuel consumption by 15 to 20% and raised the wall surface temperature by 10 degrees, because any snow against the wall was better than exposed wall in 40 below air. The most dramatic conversion was the Whitfield cabin, a conventional spruce log structure built by a Missouri family in 1888, with vertical walls, steep roof, and narrow overhangs. The Whitfields consumed 6 cords of spruce per winter and were perpetually short of fuel, spending autumn in a desperate race to cut enough wood before the deep cold arrived. Mrs. Whitfield, Sarah, visited Petak in February 1895 during the worst of the cold and was stunned by the warmth of the snow-buried cabin. She returned home and told her husband Amos that they would bank their cabin with snow, or she would take the children to her sister in Fairbanks. Amos banked the walls the next day, shoveling snow against all 4 walls to a depth of 3 feet, and the cabin's overnight temperature improved by 12 degrees that night. The following summer, Amos extended his roof overhangs and lowered his roof pitch, and the second winter's performance approached Yupik's. 2.5 cords of fuel, warm walls, comfortable dawn temperatures. Ayuluk lived in the valley cabin until 1912, when he and Pitak returned to the coast to be near aging family members. The cabin, with its leaning walls, extended overhangs, and heavy roof, stood for decades after their departure, occupied by a succession of families who maintained the snow burial practice and enjoyed the thermal benefits that Ayuluk had demonstrated. The cabin's reputation in the valley was simple and specific: the warm cabin. Not the biggest, not the finest, not the most impressive, but the warm one. The one that stayed warm when every other cabin froze. The one that burned one cord when others burned 6. The one that a Yupik man from the coast built with the understanding that the coldest thing in the north is not the snow, it is the air above the snow, and that the wisest thing a builder can do is put the snow between his walls and the air, and let the sky do the insulating. The physics of snow insulation deserved closer examination, because the mechanism by which snow kept the cabin warm was more complex than simple thermal resistance. Snow insulated through 2 mechanisms simultaneously. The first was conductive resistance. The air trapped between the ice crystals in the snowpack resisted the flow of heat from the warm wall surface to the cold air above. The same mechanism by which fiberglass and cellulose insulation worked in modern construction. This resistance was quantified as R value, and snow provided approximately R1 per inch, modest per inch, but multiplied across 4 feet of snowpack. The cumulative R48 was formidable. The second mechanism was thermal mass stabilization. The snow against the cabin wall was not merely a barrier, it was a thermal reservoir that absorbed temperature fluctuations and smoothed them out over time. When the air temperature dropped rapidly, as it did during cold snaps, when the temperature could fall 20 degrees in 2 hours, the snow absorbed the cold slowly, warming or cooling only a fraction of a degree per hour, because the energy required to change the temperature of a large mass of snow was enormous. The snow was a thermal flywheel that prevented the rapid temperature swings that made conventional cabins so miserable during cold events. Ayuluk's cabin did not experience the sharp overnight temperature drops that plagued conventional cabins, the 10-degree-per-hour cooling that forced 2 o'clock fire reloads. Because the snow encasement damped the cooling rate to approximately 1 to 2 degrees per hour, extending the thermal coasting time from 4 hours to 12 or more. The temperature gradient through the snowpack was a visible demonstration of the insulation principle. At the snow surface, the boundary between the snow and the cold air, the temperature equaled the air temperature, 40 below, 50 below, whatever the sky demanded. 6 inches into the snow, the temperature had risen to approximately 20 below. 12 inches in, 0. 18 inches, 15 above. 24 inches, 25 above. At the wall surface, where the snow contacted the logs, the temperature was approximately 30 degrees, regardless of the air temperature above. The gradient was nearly linear, dropping approximately 15 degrees per 6 inches of snow depth. And it was this gradient that made the snow such effective insulation. Each inch of snow absorbed approximately 1 degree of the total temperature difference between the warm wall and the cold air, spreading the 70-degree temperature drop across 4 feet of material, rather than concentrating it at the wall surface, as it was in an exposed cabin. The wind protection provided by the snow encasement was a benefit equal in magnitude to the insulation benefit, though less obvious. Interior Alaska wind was generally light compared to the coastal and plains regions. The sheltered valleys that trapped cold air also blocked wind. But when wind did occur during winter, typically during weather transitions when warm air masses from the coast pushed inland. The effect on conventional cabins was devastating. Wind increased heat loss through two mechanisms. It stripped the thin layer of warmed air, the boundary layer, from the exterior wall surface, exposing the wall to the full force of the cold air. And it forced cold air through every crack, gap, and imperfection in the wall construction, pressure infiltration, replacing warm cabin air with cold outside air at a rate proportional to the wind speed. The snow encasement eliminated both mechanisms. The wind could not reach the cabin walls because 5 feet of packed snow stood between the wall surface and the air. There was no boundary layer to strip because the wall was not exposed to the air. There was no pressure infiltration through the walls because the snow blocked the wind from reaching the wall surface where the cracks and gaps existed. During wind events, Yupik's cabin showed no change in interior temperature. The snow encasement was impervious to wind in a way that no chinking, weather stripping, or conventional windproofing could match. The structural loading of the snow on the walls was a concern that Yupik had addressed in the original design. 5 feet of packed snow against a wall exerted a lateral force of approximately 50 to 75 pounds per square foot at the base, a significant load that could push a poorly anchored wall inward, distorting the cabin structure and eventually causing failure. Yupik's solution was the leaning wall. By building the walls with a 10-degree outward lean, the snow load pressed the wall inward toward vertical, the direction of maximum stability, rather than pushing a vertical wall past vertical toward collapse. The leaning wall converted the snow's lateral force from a destabilizing load to a stabilizing load, and the cabin actually became more structurally rigid as the snow accumulated. By midwinter, with 5 feet of snow pressing the leaning walls toward vertical, the cabin was the most solid structure in the valley. Immovable, silent, anchored by the weight of the snow against its walls. The darkness of the snow-buried cabin was the most significant daily life challenge. With snow covering the walls to the roofline and 3 feet of snow on the roof, the only natural light entered through the single 12-inch window on the south wall. And even this window was partially obscured by the snowbanking on the south side, which reached 3 to 4 feet and blocked the lower portion of the window opening. The result was a cabin interior that was dimly lit during the brief midwinter daylight hours and completely dark for the 18 to 20 hours of darkness that characterized the interior Alaska winter. Yupik maintained a seal oil lamp, a traditional Yupik kudlik, a shallow stone dish filled with seal oil with a moss wick that provided a soft, warm light throughout the dark hours, supplemented by a kerosene lantern purchased from the trading post for special occasions and tasks requiring brighter illumination. The condensation on the interior walls during extreme cold events was a phenomenon that Yupik monitored carefully. When the outdoor temperature dropped below 50 below, the temperature gradient through the snow and the log wall sometimes allowed the interior wall surface to cool below the dew point of the cabin air, approximately 45 degrees at the humidity levels maintained by Yupik's ventilation protocol. And thin films of moisture appeared on the wall surfaces nearest the corners, where the snow insulation was thinnest and the wall surface was coldest. Yupik wiped these surfaces with a dry cloth each morning and ensured that no belongings were stored in contact with the damp wall sections. The condensation was a minor inconvenience that occurred only during extreme cold events, perhaps 5 to 10 days per winter, and caused no structural damage to the logs, which absorbed and released the small quantities of moisture without harm. The food storage system that Pitak developed around the snow-buried cabin exploited the different temperature zones created by the snow encasement. Inside the cabin, 45 to 60 degrees, suitable for daily use food, cooking supplies, and items that should not freeze. Between the cabin wall and the inner layer of snow, accessible through a small hatch in the south wall, approximately 32 degrees, suitable for fresh meat and fish that should be kept cold but not frozen. In the outer layer of the snowpack, accessible by digging into the snow from outside, approximately 0 to 20 degrees, suitable for long-term frozen storage of meat, fish, and berries. The three-zone storage system, warm, cold, and frozen, was available within arm's reach of the cabin interior, requiring no separate storage structure, no ice house, and no trips to remote cache sites during storms or extreme cold. The community gathering in the spring of 1894, after 4 winters of the snow burial cabin's operation, produced a conversation that Ayuluk remembered as a turning point. Elias Dementiev, who had by then operated his own modified snow burial cabin for 2 winters, stood at the gathering and told the assembled families that Ayuluk's method had saved him 3 cords of wood per winter, 15 days of autumn labor, and that the time he had reclaimed from woodcutting had been spent on his trapline, where it had produced approximately $40 in additional fur income per winter. The economic argument was irrefutable. The snow burial technique did not merely save fuel costs, $15 to $25 per winter, but generated income by freeing labor for productive activity, $40 per winter in Elias's case. The total annual economic benefit was approximately $55 to $65, an enormous sum in a community where annual cash income was measured in hundreds. The conversation shifted the valley's attitude from curiosity to adoption. Within 2 years, 6 families had implemented some version of snow burial, and the valley's total winter fuel consumption dropped by an estimated 30%, a collective savings of approximately 20 cords of spruce per winter that did not need to be cut, split, hauled, and stacked. The forest immediately surrounding the settlement, which had been thinning noticeably under the pressure of annual firewood harvest, began to recover, and the families who had been traveling progressively farther from the settlement to find standing timber were relieved of the increasing burden. The long-term effect of the snow burial technique on the settlement's relationship with the forest was perhaps the most important consequence of Ayuluk's innovation. A frontier settlement consuming 60 to 70 cords of firewood per winter, the pre-snow burial total, was clear-cutting the surrounding forest at a rate that would exhaust the accessible timber within 15 to 20 years, forcing the settlement to relocate or transition to a different fuel source. The post-snow burial consumption of approximately 40 to 45 cords per winter extended the sustainable harvest period to 30 or more years, because the reduced demand allowed the forest to regenerate faster than it was being cut. Ayuluk's snow did not just save fuel, it saved the forest that produced the fuel, and in saving the forest, it saved the settlement's future. Nayak grew up in the snow-buried cabin and carried its lessons into her own adult life. She married a trapper named David Peter in 1902, and built her own snow burial cabin on a site that she selected specifically for its snow accumulation characteristics, a north-facing slope at the base of a ridge where the prevailing wind deposited deep drifts every winter, providing 6 to 7 feet of natural snowbanking without any manual effort. Her cabin consumed less than 1 cord of spruce per winter, the lowest fuel consumption in the valley, and her walls were buried so deeply that only the chimney was visible above the snowpack from December through March. Visitors approaching her cabin in midwinter saw nothing but a plume of smoke rising from a featureless white landscape, and they had to call out for Nyack to direct them to the entrance. A short passage dug through the snow to the south-facing door, maintained daily by David with a shovel, and cleared after every snowfall. The knowledge that Ayuluk brought from the Yukon-Kuskokwim coast to the interior valley was not proprietary or secret. It was communal knowledge, the accumulated understanding of generations of Yupik people who had lived with snow, in snow, and because of snow for thousands of years. The Ina, the Kaskik, the Katak, the ice window, the snow-banked wall, the buried roof, each was a specific technical response to a specific thermal challenge, and each was available to any person who was willing to observe, to listen, and to accept that the people who had lived in the north for millennia might know something about winter that the newcomers did not. The condensation on the interior walls during extreme cold events was a phenomenon that Piatak monitored carefully. When the outdoor temperature dropped below 50 below, the temperature gradient through the snow and log wall sometimes allowed the interior wall surface to cool below the dew point of the cabin air, and thin films of moisture appeared on the wall surfaces nearest the corners where the snow insulation was thinnest. Piatak wiped these surfaces with a dry cloth each morning and ensured that no belongings were stored against the damp wall sections. The condensation was a minor inconvenience, occurring perhaps 5 to 10 days per winter, and caused no structural damage to the logs. The food storage system that Piatak developed exploited the different temperature zones created by the snow encasement. Inside the cabin, 45 to 60 degrees, suitable for daily use food and cooking supplies. Between the cabin wall and the inner layer of snow, accessible through a small hatch, approximately 32 degrees, suitable for fresh meat and fish that should be kept cold but not frozen. In the outer snowpack, accessible by digging from outside, approximately 0 to 20 degrees, suitable for long-term frozen storage of meat, fish, and berries. The three-zone system, warm, cold, and frozen, was available within arm's reach, requiring no separate storage structure and no trips to remote cache sites during storms. The darkness of the snow-buried cabin was the most significant daily life challenge. With snow covering the walls to the roofline and 3 feet on the roof, the only natural light entered through the single 12-inch window on the south wall, partially obscured by snowbanking. The interior was dimly lit during the brief midwinter daylight and completely dark for the 18 to 20 hours of darkness that characterized the interior Alaska winter. Piatak maintained a seal oil lamp, a traditional Yupik kudlik, a shallow stone dish with a moss wick that provided soft warm light throughout the dark hours, supplemented by a kerosene lantern from the trading post for tasks requiring brighter illumination. The psychological effect of living in a snow-buried cabin was a subject that Ayuluk and Piatak discussed with the openness of people who had grown up in semi-subterranean houses and who understood that the relationship between a dwelling and the earth was not merely structural but emotional. In the Yupik tradition, the house was not separate from the land. It was part of the land, embedded in it, connected to it, sheltered by it. The snow that buried the cabin was not an encroachment, but an embrace. The earth and sky wrapping the house in a protective layer that said, "You belong here. You are part of this place. The land will hold you." The feeling inside the snow-buried cabin was one of profound shelter. The silence, the warmth, the dim, steady light, the absolute stillness of the air. a feeling that Piatak described as being held in a cupped hand. The wind could not reach them. The cold could not reach them. The vast, terrifying emptiness of the Alaska winter, the darkness, the silence, the 40 below nothing, stopped at the snow surface and went no further. The settlers who adopted the technique reported a similar psychological shift. Sarah Whitfield, who had spent 3 winters in a conventional cabin fighting the cold with continuous stove work and the constant anxiety of dwindling firewood, described her first winter in the snow-banked cabin as the first winter she was not afraid. The fear of the deep cold, the specific physical fear that the firewood would run out, that the stove would fail, that the temperature would drop below the point where the cabin could sustain life, was absent in the snow-buried cabin because the fuel requirement was so small that the woodpile was never threatened, and the cabin's thermal performance was so robust that even a complete stove failure would allow the interior temperature to remain above freezing for 12 to 18 hours, providing ample time to restart the fire or seek shelter. The comparison between the snow-buried cabin and the other thermal innovations of the frontier revealed a hierarchy of effectiveness. The straw cellar, R30 subfloor insulation, reduced floor heat loss by approximately 70% and cut fuel consumption by 35%. The massive chimney, heat storage and recovery reduced flue heat loss by approximately 60% and cut fuel consumption by 39%. The box bed, enclosed sleeping chamber, eliminated the need for nighttime heating and cut fuel consumption by 7%. The snow tunnel, thermal seal entrance, reduced door heat loss by approximately 90% and cut fuel consumption by 28%. The snow burial, R48 total encasement, reduced wall and roof heat loss by approximately 85% and cut fuel consumption by 75 to 80%. The largest single improvement by a wide margin of any technique on the frontier. The reason was simple. The snow burial addressed the largest heat loss pathway. In a conventional cabin, 70% of heat loss occurred through the walls and roof, the surfaces exposed to the cold air. The other techniques addressed secondary pathways. The floor, 15% of loss. The chimney, 10%. The door, 5%. By insulating the primary loss surface, the walls and roof, with 4 to 5 feet of free snow, Yupik eliminated the dominant heat loss mechanism and reduced the total heating requirement to a level that 1 cord of firewood could satisfy. The durability of the snow burial technique over decades of use confirmed its soundness. Yupik's cabin, built in 1890 and operated with snow burial for 22 winters, showed no structural deterioration attributable to the snow loading or the moisture exposure. The leaning walls, designed to accept the snow load, remained structurally sound throughout. The heavy roof, designed for the combined snow and meltwater load, showed no sagging or failure. The drainage trench, maintained annually, prevented foundation moisture damage. The cabin's only structural maintenance over 22 years was periodic rechinking of the moss and clay wall ceiling, a task required by all log cabins regardless of snow exposure, and the replacement of deteriorated sod on the roof every 7 to 8 years. The economics over 22 winters were extraordinary. Construction cost, approximately $110, slightly higher than a conventional cabin due to the heavier roof structure and the angled walls. Annual fuel savings, 3 to 5 cords at $5 per cord or $15 to $25 per year. Total fuel savings over 22 winters, $330 to $550. Maintenance cost, approximately the same as a conventional cabin, rechinking and sod replacement. Net benefit over 22 winters, approximately $220 to $440, a return of 200 to 400% on the additional $50 of construction cost that the snow burial modifications required over standard construction. But the true value of the snow burial cabin was not in dollars. It was in cords not cut, in trees not felled, in autumn weeks not spent in the desperate race to stockpile enough fuel to survive the winter. It was in the warmth of a cabin that stayed warm when every other cabin froze. It was in the sleep of a family that slept soundly through 50 below nights while their neighbors woke shivering at 2 in the morning. It was in the knowledge, ancient, practical, proven by millennia of Arctic survival, that the snow is not the enemy. The snow is the gift, and the wisest builder is the one who accepts the gift and lets the sky insulate his walls. The comparison between the snow-buried cabin and the other thermal innovations of the frontier revealed a hierarchy of effectiveness. The straw cellar reduced floor heat loss and cut fuel consumption by 35%. The massive chimney reduced flue loss and cut fuel by 39%. The box bed eliminated nighttime heating needs and cut fuel by 7%. The snow burial reduced wall and roof heat loss by 85% and cut fuel consumption by 75 to 80%, the largest single improvement by a wide margin of any technique. The reason was simple. The snow burial addressed the largest heat loss pathway. In a conventional cabin, 70% of heat loss occurred through the walls and roof. By insulating these primary surfaces with 4 to 5 feet of free snow, Yupik eliminated the dominant mechanism and reduced the total heating requirement to a level that 1 cord of firewood could satisfy. The construction of the leaning walls required a modification to the standard log notching technique that Yupik had developed through experimentation during the summer of 1890. A conventional saddle notch joint, the standard method for connecting logs at the corners of a cabin, assumed vertical walls and produced a tight joint only when the logs were stacked plumb. When the walls leaned outward, the geometry of the notch changed. The upper log had to be shifted outward relative to the lower log by approximately 1 inch per course to maintain the 10-degree lean, and the notch had to be cut at a compensating angle to maintain contact between the logs across the shifted joint. Yupik solved this by cutting a modified notch, deeper on the outside of the joint and shallower on the inside, that accommodated the lean while maintaining full contact between the logs. The modified notch took approximately twice as long to cut as a standard saddle notch, a labor increase of approximately 2 days for the entire cabin, but produced a joint that was as tight and structurally sound as a conventional notch, while allowing the wall to lean at the designed angle. The roof overhang extension was the simpler modification. Standard cabin construction used roof poles that extended 12 to 18 inches beyond the wall line, providing minimal protection from rain and snow. Yupik's 3-foot overhang required longer roof poles, 14 to 16 feet, for a 12-foot cabin rather than the standard 13 feet, and additional support at the overhang tips, which Yupik provided with diagonal braces running from the wall plate to the ends of the overhang poles. The braces prevented the heavy snow load on the overhang from bending the poles downward and eventually breaking them, which would have been catastrophic. A broken overhang would dump its snow load onto the ground below, undermining the wall snow banking and exposing a section of roof to the cold air. The stove operation in the snow-buried cabin was fundamentally different from stove operation in a conventional cabin, and the difference required adjustment by anyone accustomed to conventional heating. In a conventional cabin, the stove ran at moderate to high burn for 12 to 16 hours per day, consuming a large charge of wood every 4 to 6 hours, with the intensity varying by the outdoor temperature and the cabin's heat loss rate. The stove was the primary heat source, and its operation required constant attention. Loading, adjusting the damper, cleaning the ash, monitoring the fire. In the snow-buried cabin, the stove ran at minimum burn for 8 to 10 hours per day, consuming a small charge every 6 to 8 hours, and could be left unattended for extended periods because the heat loss rate was so low that the cabin temperature dropped less than 2 degrees per hour, even with no fire at all. The stove was not the primary heat source. The snow insulation was, in a sense, the primary heat source because it prevented the loss of heat rather than producing heat, and prevented heat loss is thermally equivalent to produced heat. The stove's role was supplementary. It needed only to replace the small quantity of heat that leaked through the insulated encasement, rather than the massive quantity that poured through exposed walls and roof. This operational difference meant that the stove in a snow-buried cabin lasted longer. The reduced thermal cycling, fewer heat-up and cool-down cycles, produced less stress on the cast iron components, and the lower average burn temperature produced less creosote in the stovepipe, reducing the frequency of chimney cleaning and the risk of chimney fire. Yupik cleaned his stovepipe once per winter, in February during a mild spell, compared to the 3 to 4 cleanings per winter that conventional cabin owners performed to prevent the dangerous creosote buildup that their higher intensity burns produced. The spring emergence of the cabin from its snow encasement was an annual event that marked the transition from winter to summer as dramatically as any seasonal marker on the calendar. The snow retreated gradually, first exposing the chimney top in late March, then the ridgeline of the roof in early April, then the upper portions of the south-facing wall as the spring sun gained strength. By mid-April, the south wall was fully exposed, the window admitted full daylight for the first time in months, and the cabin interior was suddenly bright and warm from the combined effects of solar heating and the still present snow insulation on the north, east, and west walls. By late April, only the north wall retained significant snowbanking, 3 to 4 feet of compacted snow that would persist into May before finally melting and leaving the cabin fully exposed for the short, intense summer. The summer cabin was a different building from the winter cabin. Without its snow encasement, the cabin was a modest and somewhat rough log structure with leaning walls that looked odd and a low roof with wide overhangs that looked deliberately heavy. The summer temperature inside the cabin was cooler than outside. The heavy log walls and thick sod roof provided thermal mass that moderated the temperature swings of the interior Alaska summer, where daytime temperatures could reach 80 degrees and nighttime temperatures dropped to 40. But the summer performance was not the cabin's purpose. The cabin existed for winter. It was designed for winter, built for winter, and optimized for winter. Summer was the interlude between the winters that defined the cabin's function and justified its unusual design. No myths, no miracles. Just snow against the walls, snow on the roof, and the understanding that the warmest wall in the coldest winter is the one you cannot see, buried under 5 feet of the best insulation the earth provides for free.